I'll briefly touch on this, which is a case study that was done with IMU STEP, and then we'll open it up for questions because I'm sure a lot of people have questions. And I really like this kind of quote at the end of Rob Whalen's paper, which said, in order to develop a successful exercise study, one must carefully quantify the daily load history. And what we learn also is if we really want to develop a successful rehab and optimize rehab, we also need to carefully understand the daily load history. And the first thing we need to do, of course, is measure and quantify these loads. So this is a case study that has been published by iMeasureU, and it was work that Dean Golich did with Holly Lawrence. And Holly is a world champion Ironman athlete. She suffered a navicular fracture of her right foot. It was then fixated, so it was a macroscopic failure that required a screw. She went for a run, actually a competition afterwards, and actually fractured again. She still managed to finish the competition though, finished the race. But the question is now what? And so Dean was faced with this. Dean started working with her after she, before she had surgery. So the idea is, how do we bring her back to high performance sport, knowing that she's had this horrible fracture? Now, at the time they had an AlterG treadmill, and so the cool thing about the AlterG treadmill is you can dial in a change in the offloading, if you like, and say, I want to run at 80% of my body weight. So you can dial this in, the treadmill pushes you off the ground, and you can run at reduced gravitational loading. What's actually really important here, though, is that the accelerations and the impact that you receive on the ground are not necessarily linearly related to what you dial in on the AlterG. And Dean found this out pretty quickly, and he recognized that running speed had a much greater influence on bone strain. And this goes back to what Brent Edwards was also showing, that the running speed is a really important factor here in the probability of failure of the tissue. So AlterG is a fantastic tool. You can mitigate some of the loads. You can maintain metabolic cost of locomotion, which is really good. But it's important to recognize that dialing up 80% of body weight does not necessarily lead to 80% reduction in the impact loads and the strains that are going to be experienced by the bone. So this is kind of lesson number one, if you like, from this case study. So what Dean did, he took a graded approach, as anyone would do with an athlete who's suffered a fracture. But the really interesting anecdotes that we take when we speak with Dean about how this occurred and how he used IMU STEP was that, he came up with the statement and said, look, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd go back in time and get this baseline information on this athlete, so he could understand for every speed or the distance or different types of terrain, he would have a snapshot of or a profile of what the bone load would look like and what the individual symmetry and impacts would look like on each limb. And of course, this is the great thing that you can do now. You can wear these sensors over an entire session, and you can gather this information. And that's what many of you maybe in the audience are doing right now. And here you can see in this first session, straight away you can see symmetry changes as you would expect. So Holly has a fracture in her right foot, so you can see the impact loads that she's experiencing on her right foot are far less than a left foot. You see this also in the bone stimulus. So again, this is the stimulus or the mechanical fatigue variable that we have within IMU STEP, and you can see a discrepancy here. Note also the shape of this. So it's again mimicking that idea of probability of fracture. You kind of reach this plateau, and then it stays fairly stable. And of course, this is again weighting the magnitude of load more than the number of cycles. And so Dean then progressed Holly through a running regime where he would slowly introduce load, and she would come back with good rest in between. Rest is important. It's also interesting. So the group from Indiana University Roebling and colleagues had some really nice papers some time ago showing that if you have intermittent rest in between your activity, you can actually stimulate those osteocytes more than if you had continual exercise. So this is really, really useful for an athlete who's recovering from injury to say you can do shorter bursts of activity and receive a heightened stimulus to the bone. So that's a really interesting take-home message here, that you don't necessarily need to be doing longer and longer workouts. You could be doing more intense workouts over short periods of time, and you would get to the same bone stimulus. And so what we're seeing here is a progression. So now 4th of September, a couple of weeks, this is the session number 8. We're already seeing some sort of equilibrium in terms of bone stimulus to the right side of the foot, and we're starting to see more of this pattern emerging. What's also interesting about these is you can characterize the distribution in those impact loads. And on the left side, which is not injured, you see a far more uniform pattern of impact loading. And as you continue then to progress, you see these patterns emerging where you have more uniform loading between the left and right limbs. And again, you see some discrepancy here between left and right limb. And Dean was also noticing that as Holly would say, get tired, she might revert back potentially to offloading that limb. This is where real-time feedback becomes really useful. So if you can monitor and measure these loads in real time, you can give this feedback to your athlete as they're actually exercising, which is a really interesting paradigm. So what does this look like over the season? And I'm just going to quickly wrap up here. And over a season, you can look at, say, medium and high impact sessions. So these are all of the sessions across a period of several months where Holly is returning to her normal activity. And if we look just at the medium type of activity through the sessions, we can see some rest periods in between. There was a longer rest period here, but the idea is that you're slowly alternating between your more medium type of activity with your higher activity. And if you just look at the higher impact activity alone, you'll see a graded increase here. And this is what Dean is doing. He's bringing her back to the more higher intensity that she is used to experiencing. So these equate essentially to faster running speed. So she's getting back to her race pace, doing more intense workouts. And you'll notice also some significant gaps. So these are rest periods. The key thing here is that Dean is working with Holly and trying to get her feedback about what she feels like as well. You've obviously got to take that into consideration. Was this a hard workout for her? Is she feeling some pain? And use that as an indicator of, have I received enough of the stimulus? Because there is unfortunately no magic number when you're looking at the values here. There is no magic number that says, absolutely, if you get to this bone stimulus, you've had enough. It's really dependent on the status of your bone, the quality or the strength of your bone, how much load and load history that bone has undergone. So I'm going to close it out here with this other quote. Again, this is from Stu Warden, Irene and Davis and Mike Frederickson's paper, which says, the microdamage accumulation and subsequent risk for developing these bone stress injuries is related both to the load that's applied to the bone and the ability of the bone to resist that load. So that's the strength of the bone. And of course, the former is more amenable to intervention. So the loads applied to the bone is more amenable to interventions and can be modified in terms of training design and the program that you put with your athletes. So this is really then the space that we're occupying with IMU STEP. It's providing you with a tool to better manage your athletes and the loads that they experience. So I'm going to close it up there. I'm going to thank you for your attention. Just noting also that Holly returned to racing early in 2019, several months after Dean first started working with her. And the good news was that she won her first race back from injury. And thus far as I know, she's still running injury-free.